basically today, what I want to talk about really just kind of get into some different components of economic equality in our society, and more so looking at it from a couple specific things. So some of the policies that basically created the level of segregation that we have in our society are still very, very, very prevalent, and they've created a lot of inequality. So basically, the presentation that I have, and that I'll go through as soon as I can pull it up, is basically going to lay out how some of the, especially in particular, housing policies that were created by the Federal Housing Administration, how they really created a lot of segregation, or just continued and even furthered the segregation that we have in our society. And then also on top of that, created a tremendous amount of economic inequality. So that'll kind of be some of the main topics. And then really looking at ways that we can address those issues. And again, as we said, as the title of the presentation says, move towards a more equitable and just society, because ultimately that's really where we'd like to go. So just give me a quick sec to see if I can get this thing back up and running.
There we go. Yeah. All right. So, it's interesting though. So things like this, right? It just shows you the importance of patience, right? So I think if there's anything that we've learned in 2020 is things in life that are worth having are worth waiting for. Patience is important. And also, if we want to rebuild our society and we want to bring equity and justice in our society, it's going to take patience, it's going to take perseverance, and it's going to take going through difficult things, right? And I really enjoy kind of learning more about your class and what you've been talking about. So I kind of have an understanding of kind of where they are in their context of their understanding. So in the class, what you guys talking a lot about slavery. So slavery, a lot of times when people talk about racism in America, a lot of times some people actually stop with slavery and they say, well, okay, slavery was a long time ago, so that doesn't really impact me because that was so many generations ago, right? But what a lot of people don't do is they don't really draw the lines and see how slavery and then the policies and procedures that came after slavery have a major impact in the way our society is today, right? So the reason why there are statues and monuments for certain people, the reason why parks are named after certain people, the reasons why buildings are named after people, all of those things kind of come together, right? But I think, and just to kind of begin the presentation, the first step to solve any problem is to acknowledge that there is a problem in the first place, right? So just the fact that we have people here who are willing to have a discussion about race, who are willing to have a discussion about inequality, that is the first step, right? So just acknowledging that there is a problem and that we can do better, right? That even though this is a great country, there's many wonderful things about America, there are also many things that we can improve. And if we make a concerted effort, we can get there. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, as we make our society more equitable, more just, more humane, ultimately we'll have a stronger country at the end of the day. So if we start from that mind frame, I think these discussions will be very, very, very fruitful. All right. So race and racism are very difficult subjects to address. So I know a lot of you guys, I'm not sure how many of you are history majors, but some people may even ask you like, why are you taking a class on slavery? Like, why are you talking about race? A lot of times people don't even want to even talk about these issues. They don't even want to address these issues because they're very difficult to talk about, right? Because a lot of times they're a lot more complex than they just appear, right? So there's surface level understanding of race and racism, and then there's next level understanding of it as well, right? And a lot of times people don't understand that how long the consequences of even 5 or 10 years of racist policy can have on people's overall economic health, right? Another thing is it also can be very traumatic. So a lot of times, people will ask people to talk about race, but sometimes people don't want to talk about race, right? And the reason why they don't want to talk about race is because a lot of times people deny that racism even exists, right? I can't remember when it was, but there are some people who you ask them, does racism exist? They'll say it doesn't even exist at all. They'll say there's no such thing as systematic racism, things like that, right? So people who have been victims of racism, that is very traumatic to them, right? Because you're talking about something that some people won't even uh, acknowledge even exist at all, right? And then in other instances, you have people who are just willfully ignorant because they can be, because they don't have to deal with race, they don't have to deal with racism on a daily basis, so they're able to just be ignorant of it because it has not directly impacted them, right? And I think the one thing that I'm really going to emphasize, and this is kind of the theme of my talk today, is that in order to address racism, you have to be bold and equally as intentional as the original racist policies, right? So let me kind of reemphasize that. There were policies put in place that were specifically developed to create economic inequality, to create a situation where one race would have much more than another race. So in order to do that, in order to address that, you have to go deeper. You have to directly attack that, and you have to be very, very intentional about what you're trying to do. So a great book that I think I would suggest anyone would read if you have not already read is The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. Right, this is an excellent book that basically talks about how the federal government not only sponsored but also mandated segregation. So in this book, he goes into a lot of detail, and this is very, very, very powerful because a lot of people maybe are somewhat unfamiliar with this process or what happened during this era. But The Color of Law is a very excellent book to read if you want to understand kind of the history of modern segregation within America, within our suburbs. Right, this talks about the suburban life and how that developed. So four key takeaways from the book. So the federal government, it provided loan guarantees to developers. So basically, if someone wanted to develop, let's say, go get a farm and build 100 houses or 200 houses, the federal government through the Federal Housing Agency would guarantee those loans. So meaning that a bank wouldn't have to take a risk. But the condition on that loan would be that they would not sell those houses to African Americans, right? So the developer actually would have to agree that they would not sell houses to African Americans, even if they could afford it, right? So if you look at some of the covenants and some of the neighborhood association documents from this era, a lot of them explicitly state that you cannot sell your house to an African American, right? Then on top of that, white families were given low interest loans and they were able to buy these houses at very, very, very affordable rates, right? Now, what happens after this policy comes into place, that's when you start seeing the creation of highways, right? So I-75, all the major highways. So now these suburban areas that were somewhat kind of remote and kind of out the way, now these are becoming prime locations. So guess what happens to the property values in these locations? They go through the roof. So now billions of dollars in equity was created, and Black families or African American families were prohibited from being able to own these properties. So that wealth was concentrated in the hands of white families who were able to buy homes in those developments. Right now, a lot of times what people don't realize about home values and home equity is that it's not just about how much your house is worth. Right, home equity can also be used as collateral for loans. So let's say that I wanted to start a manufacturing business, or I wanted to start a restaurant, or any other business, right? If I don't have, said cash to be able to start that business, what I can do is I can use my home as collateral and get a loan, right? So this is why business ownership rates are so much higher. One of the reasons why business ownership rates are so much higher in non-Black communities, because these communities have access to property that they can use as collateral to be able to start and expand businesses, right? So these are things, again, that have contributed tremendously to the economic inequality that we see today. So some people are more like numerical in mind. So, and I'm kind of I'm a mix of quantitative / qualitative person. So I like to kind of draw things out in numbers so people can kind of just see exactly what we're talking about, right? So basically what happened here is a perfect economic situation, right? Where, well, let me say a perfect economic situation to create the maximum amount of inequality possible, right? So here's what happened, right? So if not to get too financy and too high level here, but if the basic principles of money are this: the most valuable thing about money is the time that you have it invested. So if you ever go talk to a financial advisor, they'll say, if you start investing in your 20s, your money will grow so much more. If you start investing in your 40s, even if you invest more, it's still, because it's later in your life, you won't have the same thing. So take that same concept and apply that to generations of one race and generations of another race. And that's why you have these great inequalities, right? So white families were able to buy these houses during the height of housing affordability, right? So they were able to buy these homes when they were at the cheapest amount possible, right? So when they were able to buy them and blacks were prohibited to be able to buy them, they were able to buy these houses at the cheapest amount possible. So, and some people may see these numbers and laugh, but remember, in 1940, the average home value was $3,000, right? Which is still, I shook my head when I saw this stat. I was like, $3,000. But if you take that and equate it to $2020, that's still only $55,000, right? So just imagine, now buying a house for $55,000. Just to kind of give you some numbers to go with that, a home payment on a $55,000 home would be about $215 a month, right? So how many of y'all are paying more than $215 in rent or mortgage right now? All of us are, way more, right? And this is the average median house. This is not the cheapest house possible, right? This is the average. So today, the average home value in America is $289,000, which is 5 times more expensive, almost 6 times, actually almost 6 times more expensive when you equate it to the same dollar amount. So basically, the same exact property would have cost $55,000 in 1940 terms. Now today costs $289,000. So to kind of bring it together, if you were able to accumulate land or homes during this era, now you have property that's extremely valuable, right? That's worth properties that are worth hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, and that creates a tremendous amount of income inequality, right? So this chart right here really drives it home, right? What this chart shows you is what is called median net worth, right? Which is like the value. Your net worth is basically the amount of money you have after what you owe, right? And what you'll see on this chart, I don't know if you guys can see my arrow or not, but when people are in the 18 to 34 age range, there's not much of a gap, right? There's a gap, but there's not much of a gap, right? The reason why there's not much of a gap is because at that point, the gap is only based on your salary, right? So in our society, there is a lot of inequality when it comes to pay, but it's not humongous, right? What really, really, really makes the difference in wealth and net worth is inheritances, right? So the amount of money that you inherit from other people changes dramatically your economic outlook. And there's 2 reasons why. One, because inherited money is not taxed the same way income is, right? So because of that, you can accumulate much more money easier and without the same tax implications when you inherit it versus when you earn it. All right. So that right there in itself is the big issue. So what you'll see is that, okay, so in the 18 to 34 range, when most people are, you say, okay, well, my friend, I make, 60,000, he makes 70,000. That's not that big of a deal. But what ends up happening is those little bit of gaps, when you start putting that and investing it and doing other things like that, over time, it just explodes and grows, right? Now, here are other things that happen in this time frame that makes it grow. This is when people start to reap the benefits of having parents or either grandparents who have already accumulated wealth. Because 1, they can pay for them to go to college so they don't have to take out student loans. That's a major thing. 2, they could give them down payments to buy their first home, right? 3, when people begin to transition, they're able to inherit money, right? So just imagine the difference between an 18-year-old who had to pay for his own college, who had to pay his own down payment for his house, who did not inherit anything and maybe even had to pay funeral expenses for their grandparents or older people in their family, versus someone whose parents paid for them to go to college, whose parents gave them a down payment for their first house, and they inherited money from their grandparents, right? You see how this income inequality just jumps, right? And what makes it difficult and what makes it hard is that the wealth that people are inheriting and benefiting from was derived from racist policies, right? So that's what makes things very, very, very controversial. I'm gonna come back to this a little bit later, but this is where you get into problems, right? So here's the question, right? What can money buy? So a lot of times, we think about money and we think of fancy cars, we think of jewelry, we think of things like that. But money can also buy a lot of other things that are on the social side that we'll talk about, right? So it can buy political and social influence, right? So if I have a lot of money, guess what? I can donate to a university and get a building named after me. I can donate to some charity and they can name a scholarship after me. I can commission a statue of myself or someone who I admire, right? Because I'm the one with the money, right? In our society, we value people who have money. And a lot of times, to be frank, we do not assess and judge how they got that money, right? So now we're having that. Now we're having those discussions, right? Where we're like, hey, this person, yes, they were a billionaire or a millionaire, but they got their money through slavery or through a lot of exploitation. We care about those things now, but in previous times, we really didn't care about those things that much, right? It also gives you the ability to impact how history is interpreted, right? People who are professors are, work in the academy. We know that a lot of our research is funded by grants, is funded by, foundations, it's funded by, various outside entities. So those people have the ability to say, well, I don't really like this study. It's not looking at things the way I wanted to, right? So it really has so you can use money and influence to impact how history is interpreted. You can buy legitimacy. And it also gives you to the ability to access exclusive opportunities, right? Being able to afford to go to expensive schools, being able to afford to, be a part of exclusive programs. These are things that these are the non, kind of obvious things that people can do with money. And this is why you have statues. This is why you have buildings named after certain people. This is why it's controversial, because when you have money, you can do these things and you don't have to worry about people who don't have the money and the power to influence the situation. Right now, over time, one thing, and not to get too much off track, and we could talk about this kind of more in the Q&A, is that social media has kind of leveled that playing field a little bit, right? So now I can't just be a millionaire and give a $100,000 donation and take out an ad in the New York Times and kind of clear my name of bad things. You can't really do that anymore now because of social media and heightened social consciousness of a lot of people. Now people want more answers and they want more substantive change, and that's why you will see over time more and more discussions about statues, about names, about a lot of different things. Here in Tallahassee, we had a similar situation where there's a few statues on Florida State's campus that people have been calling to remove. People have been calling to rename the stadium. The stadium was named after Doak Campbell, and some comments came out that he made about desegregating the school. Now people were talking about renaming the stadium. So these things are these are things that are very much on the forefront. But what I want people to see is how all these things kind of play in together, right? They're not just in isolation, right? Another impact of our segregation is our education system, right? So in our system, we idolize a lot of times, not everyone, of course, but many times we idolize people who have committed horrific acts against each other, against other people, right? So, even someone being a president of the United States, which is an amazing feat, we can't ignore the fact that that person owned slaves. We can't ignore the fact of what type of things happened during slavery. We can't ignore what happened to human lives in the during those eras. So even if someone accomplished great things, we still need to put that caveat. And a lot of times it's not really properly taught, right? Again, statues and other monuments immortalizing people who've committed atrocities. I mean, we see it all over the place. I mean, if you come to the South, you'll see several Confederate monuments all over the place. You'll see, schools named after people from the Confederacy, and then, of course, these are always controversial. So there's a lot of heated debate about, you know, this and that, this and that. But this is what you see, and people are very offended by it. But the problem is, the people who are offended by it don't have the power because they don't have the access to the wealth, right? So they're unable to influence the discussion, right? And another thing that you see is that there's a lack of diverse opinions in decision making arenas, right? So a lot of times people will put together a panel of experts, but they may only put one African American person on the panel, right? And expect that African American person to speak for one all African Americans, but then also be comfortable enough to speak out in that situation, right? Where they're the extreme minority. So you see that a lot of times happening, and that causes some issues. All right. So there's a lot of challenges that we face when we try to address these issues. This year we saw the Black Lives Matter movement. We saw a lot of other social justice movements that really have been placing pressure on our government, on our institutions, on a lot of different types of people. So what most people have chosen to do is attack what I call low hanging fruit. So low hanging fruit are things like statues, Confederate flags, controversial mascots, other things like that. A lot of cities, a lot of universities have just gone straight to that. Like, okay, we're going to take the statue down. We're going to remove the Confederate flags. I think the SEC banned Confederate flags from football games. Many other things, right? So these are what I call low hanging fruit items, right? So they are significant, they are important. However, there's still a lot more work that needs to be done, right? Thousands of diversity and inclusion positions have been created. Now, pretty much every institution has a chief diversity officer, and they've created many, many other offices to deal with diversity and inclusion. So those, who are in the area of diversity and inclusion, they've been very, very, very busy over the last few months, right? And then a lot of people are being hired into these positions. And these are all well-meaning, right? And these are great things. However, we have to acknowledge the fact that we are skipping steps, right? And here's what I mean by that when I say we're skipping steps. Segregation still exists to this day. Segregation is still as prevalent today as it was even during the times that discussed in the book, right? So you'll find, and this is what's shocking to a lot of people, but people who study this knew there are many boards or corporations that have no black members whatsoever, no black executives, no black board members, nothing, right? There are many universities that have entire departments with no black faculty members, none, not even one, right? There are many cities that have no black elected officials, right? So what I'm trying to emphasize is that hiring or electing the first is not diversity. That is desegregation, right? Some places, many entities, many institutions never desegregated, despite the fact of the laws changing. They still have never desegregated fully, right? Or to a reasonable level, right? So, I always put this out there. So if an organization is only desegregating, 60 or so years after it became illegal, what does that say about the true values of that organization, right? So people are just all of a sudden now wanting to desegregate or wanting to diversify. Does that entity truly believe in what they're doing, right? And I think that's what we're going to see over the next 5, 10 or so years is that, okay, was 2020 just a flash in the pan where people, hired a couple of people, or did organizations and institutions really begin to value diversity, right? Did we really start taking the real steps toward making change, or did we just kind of just pay lip service to the fact, right? So going back to the chart, all right. When you have this sort of inequality in net worth, it's almost impossible to have social equality, right? In a capitalist society, we are taught to value people who are wealthy, right? If I came on here today and said I'm a millionaire, people would listen to me. regardless of how I got that $1 million, anything like that. They would listen to me socially because of my economic status, right? So basically, in our society, we live in a country where your economic status can really dictate social status, right? And even if, let's say, for example, an African American person happens to be economically well-to-do, they're always going to be seen as an anomaly and not the norm, right? So, people like myself, I've been blessed. I've had the opportunity to, go to great schools, get a great education. I've been exposed to a lot of great things. But so people will see me as an exception, not the norm, right? And that's not what we want, right? We want a society where everyone has, the opportunity to achieve highly within society, right? So we need bold, non-symbolic action. That's what we need. So not symbolism, not taking down flags, not taking down statues, not just taking down flags and statues, things like that. Of course, those are part of the discussion. However, we need to go beyond that, right? So I'll just use, again, I like to use real estate. That's something I'm familiar with. So I use real estate as an example. So in a neighborhood where more than 50% of the population is Black, homes are worth on average 48,000 less, right? And that's controlled for any other variable. That means quality of schools. That means crime. That means job. Any other variable that you can think of that impacts home values. Simply the presence of Black people in a neighborhood drops property value, right? And that is just something that just, when you look at the numbers, is just unbelievable, but it is factual. You can take the exact same house, the exact same level of schools, the exact same level of everything, and compare them. And again, the presence of Black people in the neighborhood drops the value of the property by $48,000 on average. And we take that across the board, that is billions and billions of dollars that Black homeowners are being robbed of. And that has a tremendous impact, not just on economics, but also social justice within our society. All right. So just like the federal government forced and economically incentivized segregation, it must do the same for integration. We cannot continue to live in a rapidly, just wildly segregated society. We're never going to get to equality in that situation. So right now, a lot of cities, and I'll use Tallahassee for an example, Tallahassee has what we call an inclusionary housing policy, right? Meaning that if you want to build a new subdivision, you have to have a certain percentage of those houses for um, uh, low and moderate income people, right? So you can't just go and build a subdivision with, $500,000 houses. If you're going to build a subdivision now, in order to get a permit from the city, you have to hold, I think it's either 10 or 15% of the houses aside, set them aside for low income residents. And I think they have some similar policies in Ohio. I'm not quite sure about the exact details, but there's some similar policies, right? But what I'm saying is these are the type of things that need to be expanded and further incentivized to eliminate segregation. Now, there's been a lot of pushback about that. A matter of fact, I think it's been something that's came up in the political campaigns, is that a lot of people are concerned about these inclusionary housing policies because they think that it's going to lower the value of their property, right? So this is something that's just very, 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 very intriguing and very interesting. I think it's something that we need to watch, is that these inclusionary housing policies, which are created to right the historic wrongs of segregation done by FHA, now a lot of them are under attack. All right. Another thing is, any entity that uses or receives taxpayer dollars should have minimum employment and supplier diversity standards. Right. There's no reason why any state institution, any federal institution should have gross inequality within their employment ranks. Right. And then also the suppliers that they use to give them paper to build the buildings, things like that, there also needs to be diversity in there. And there also needs to be a lot of funding for Black-owned businesses or enterprises, because of the fact that Black-owned businesses don't have access to the same collateral that white-owned businesses have had historically, right? So because of that, they're unable. One of the reasons why a lot of Black businesses are unable to access capital to grow and expand, and that's also a reason why you have a lot of high unemployment in African American communities, right? So kind of just to wrap things up, and before I get to a couple solutions, is that I want everyone to realize this. You can't just stop being racist, right? That's not enough. You can't just say, okay, we're done with this, or this is over. We're not going to do this anymore. You have to work tirelessly to eliminate the impact of generations of racist policies. All right. So let me say that again. You can't just stop being racist. You can't just outlaw slavery. You can't just outlaw Jim Crow. You can't just, give blacks the right to vote. You can't just, desegregate schools. You can't just all of a sudden hire one or two people. You have to address the fact that for generations and generations, certain people have been blocked from opportunities, and you have to do things to address those policies. Right. So a couple solutions that I kind of put out there, and like I said, I'm always glad to have discussions on potential solutions with everyone. Is that in order to fix these long-standing justice, you have to combine economic solutions also with social solutions. So when you remove statues, when you rename buildings, and then also on top of that, you put some economic plans behind that, that accelerates progress, right? Because the economics and the social piece together is how you accelerate the progress on bringing about equality. So you have to have concurrent, and you have to have both long-term and also short-term policies, right? So you can't just say, okay, I want to do this. You have to have a 20, 30, 40, 50, maybe even 100-year plan, right? You can't just make a policy for 1 or 2 years when you're dealing with hundreds of years of inequality. It's something that needs to be done, right? We have to continue training and education efforts. I would say the thing that made me smile the most about the movements over the summer and over the towards the end of the spring was the diversity of people who are standing up against injustice, and that is directly correlated to diversity and inclusion training in classes in high school and also classes in colleges and all throughout. Right, we've seen that. Right, if you really looked at the makeup of the crowds, these were younger people who had received better education, more diverse education, so they understood the systemic problems that we have in our society, and they were willing to speak up about it. Right. Last thing is we need to force desegregation in all aspects of society. Right. Desegregation, segregation can no longer be acceptable. Right. We don't want all white neighborhoods, all black neighborhoods, all Latino neighborhoods. We need to move past that. Right. We need people to live together and live in harmony and in equality, and ultimately at the end of the day, will be a lot stronger. So I'll go ahead and stop there. And any questions people want to ask, I'm more than happy to have a great Q&A. And then if people want to contact me on any of my social medias or my email, I'm glad to have you reach out as well.